to the What Really Happened radio show. Because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Monday, February 2nd, 2015, getting into the next month here. And, of course, we had Groundhog Day, and Puxatawny Phil saw his shadow, meaning there will be 6 more weeks of winter. Apparently, during the festivities, the groundhog bit the mayor. I'm not sure how that works. Yesterday was the Super Bowl. The New England Patriots pulled off a fourth-quarter turnaround for the victory. Halftime show with Katy Perry apparently has all the religious people upset over the very obvious symbolic references to the Book of Revelations and, you know, riding the beast and the rest of that. And as usual, of course, the best of commercials were on the air. Some of them I thought were a little lame. I did love the Budweiser spot about the lost dog. And the one with Liam Neeson for the little cell phone game, that was funny. That was very funny. And I love the fact that Liam doesn't really take himself all that seriously here. All right, the phone lines are open. 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now then, serious news taking place over in Ukraine, and they're talking about the aborted attempt, or the rather for show attempt, to broker some kind of a truce. But apparently tanks are rolling in Poland as NATO plans and expands permanent Eastern European bases. They're going right back to that whole Cold War, fortifying Europe against the evil Russian Empire. The shelling against civilian targets in Donetsk is continuing, and the peace talks in Minsk basically collapsed. All they did was point fingers at each other, which was a foregone conclusion, because the only people who met in Minsk were representatives of Ukraine and Russia, and the representatives from Ukraine saying, this is all your fault, and Russia saying, absolutely not, we're not involved in this. And the people who should have been in Minsk but were not invited were, of course, the leadership of these separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. And if you don't have them there, nothing is going to be accomplished. Apparently, they didn't even show up the first day of the scheduled talks. Showed up the second day to say, all right, we have to look like we're trying to do something here. Article out of RINF.com, Ukraine, yes, we target civilians, and the separatists are saying the targeting maps are proving it. They are targeting civilians. That's a war crime. Now, over the weekend, there was a story about how 2 medium-range ballistic missiles from Kiev blew up in midair. And maybe they did and maybe they didn't, but we're seeing a story today over at Investment Watch blog how a large Ukrainian ballistic missile was successfully intercepted by the Lugansk People's Republic. So Kiev is starting to employ really heavy weapons. They're terror strikes. That's exactly what Hitler was doing to Great Britain with the V-1 buzz bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile. Now, here's an interesting article. There's a YouTube video out. We have it linked to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. And it says, brokered it and broke it. And basically what is in the video is Obama is essentially admitting U.S. involvement in the coup d'etat against Ukraine's elected government a year ago, which triggered the subsequent bloodbath. They're now out there saying, yeah, we were involved there. You know, it's our foreign policy, and that's what we're going to do here. Meanwhile, Obama is asking for an additional $168 million to counter Russia in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And again, it's the big lie. Russia's not doing anything. This is all U.S. aggression. Invasion, drone strike, coup d'etat. Now, supposedly, next week in Washington, D.C., Angela Merkel is going to sit down for a meeting with Barack Obama to discuss arming Ukraine. And the spin of the story is, yes, the U.S. has been sending in non-lethal assistance to Kiev, which may already be a lie for reasons we'll discuss in a little bit. But now they want to openly send in heavy weapons to Kiev to use against those civilians in the eastern Ukraine for not wanting to be part of the European Union and the European Central Bank, especially after they see what's happening in Greece and Spain and France and Italy. Now, there's another video we linked to. I couldn't embed it, so you're going to have to follow the link. And it's labeled Fascington Terrorists Attacking Mariupol, Video by the Terrorists. And it's a selfie video by the forces that are attacking Mariupol on behalf of Kiev. And at the 3-minute mark, you see one of the attackers' shoulder very clearly, which is displaying the patch of the Golden Hawks Brigade. This is U.S. Special Forces on the ground in combat in Ukraine. It's another reminder that you cannot take anything the U.S. government says about what's going on at face value here. Meanwhile, outgoing Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel is saying, you know, we're going to need ground troops in Iraq. It's time to get the ground troops back in there. And, of course, my reply to that is, here's your rifle, Chuck. Here's your parachute. Here's your day-glow orange jumpsuit left over from Abu Ghraib. And you go on in and you have yourself a heck of a good time. This is literally the third invasion of Iraq by the United States because those gosh darn Iraqi people will not stay conquered. Story, another YouTube video. U.S. plans to arm Iraq's Sunni tribesmen with AK-47s, RPGs, and mortars. Which is weird because it wasn't all that long ago that we were told these were the bad guys. You know, these Al-Qaeda are bad, we must kill them, and these Al-Qaeda are good because they're turning against our enemies and we will give them guns and bombs. There's a very interesting article over at safehaven.com called The Failed Yemen Model. And it's pointing out about how last September, Obama was citing the drone program in Yemen as a successful model of U.S. anti-terrorism strategy, and how he hoped to employ the Yemen model in his effort to degrade and destroy ISIS in Iraq and Syria, meaning the current governments of Iraq and Syria. But as we know, a week ago, the U.S. puppet regime in Yemen collapsed. And the U.S. embassy in Yemen's capital was forced to evacuate and shut down. Now, if that's the new kind of model for foreign intervention, it shows how badly U.S. interventionism has failed. Now, Yemen is militarily important because whoever controls Yemen controls access to the Red Sea from the Gulf of Aden. It's an important choke point. So get ready to send your sons and daughters off to Yemen to conquer another part of the world that doesn't want to be ruled by the United States. Over in Israel, their foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, has declared outright a third war on Lebanon and a fourth Gaza operation are now inevitable because of the retaliatory attack by Hezbollah. And so, just to give you an idea of how Israel thinks, Israel sent in drones in an unprovoked attack into Syria. Killed some Hezbollah, killed some Iranians. Hezbollah fights back, and Israel says that's our justification for new wars against Lebanon and Gaza. It's all their fault, Mom. Anybody complaining about a drone strike, that's just petty here. Netanyahu is apparently trying to put more pressure on the United Nations, specifically through Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, to somehow find a way to blame Iran for this Lebanon attack against the Israeli convoy. And Netanyahu's wringing his hand and saying, where's the world reaction condemning Iran? We have to condemn Iran. And, of course, mostly it's the world knows that Bibi is basically full of bovine excrement, and they're getting tired of this constant cry wolf, send other people's children out to war. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And I was looking at some of the members' posts over at whatreallyhappened.com, and one of them caught my eye. And I just promoted it to the front page. WTF is going on here, and it makes an interesting point here. You have France that voted to give Palestine statehood. Then they get attacked by ISIS at Charlie Hebdo. Then you have Japan, who gave Palestine $100 million to reconstruct Gaza, and suddenly ISIS takes and executes supposedly 2 Japanese hostages. Doesn't really seem a consistent pattern of thought there, where ISIS is attacking those nations which are basically showing humanity to the Arab world. Now, there's an interesting article over at The Real News about how Netanyahu and Boehner's tag teaming on Iran could and seems to be backfiring on both of them right now. It's created huge amounts of hostility, certainly with the White House. It's actually caused a tremendous amount of friction between Netanyahu and American supporters of Israel. You have people like Nancy Pelosi and Abe Foxman coming out and saying this was not a good thing to do. And Boehner and Netanyahu may be sharing that petard. Story coming out of Ib Times, according to a human rights group over in Israel, roughly 40% of Palestinian children detained by the Israeli authorities are subjected to sexual abuse at the hands of the Israeli police. It's amazing stuff here. Now, there are times when you should be proud of what you're doing, and there are times when you were really better off keeping your mouth shut. There's a very interesting article that came over Middle East Monitor, where Israeli Intelligence and Strategic Affairs Minister Yuval Steinitz proclaimed on Sunday that the sanctions being imposed on Iran were the result of Israel's efforts at lobbying the various governments in the P5+1. And he says, it is not just that we don't want the P5+1. Israel's goal is for Iran to surrender all nuclear technology. Tear down the power stations, shut down the medical isotope factories, all of it, which Iran is allowed to have under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has signed and ratified, and the United States has signed and ratified. But Israel, which does have nuclear weapons, being built in that not very secret factory underneath Dimona, wants Iran to simply go back to last century in terms of technology. Now, Iran is not going to voluntarily tear down their nuclear power station now that it's bought and paid for and is actually providing electricity to the grid. So we know where this is going. This is going somewhere where Israel thinks they have a right and a justification to bomb Iran's civilian power station the same way they did Iraq's civilian power station. And back then, Israel was screaming, they're building bombs in the basement, they're building bombs in the basement. And following the 2003 invasion, of course, international experts examined the remains of the Osirak power station, and they found nothing there but the ruins of a power station. There was no clandestine bomb facility there. Israel's batting zero at detecting other countries' illegal activities. But basically, I think they're engaging in projection. What Israel is doing, underhanded, they put on to others to make it okay for them to do that. It's like when you see a couple and the guy's playing around on his marriage. And the first thing he's going to do is accuse the wife of having an affair, because that equalizes the guilt on both sides. Now, here's an interesting article over at 21st Century Wire, and it's talking about how U.S. General James Cartwright, who at one point was considered Obama's general, has been indicted for espionage. Now, if you're wondering who he was spying for, he wasn't actually spying for anybody. He's being prosecuted for espionage for blowing the whistle on Operation Olympic Games, which planted the Stuxnet and Flame viruses in the Iranian nuclear facilities to try and derail Iran's civilian nuclear power program. And, of course, the revelations put a serious crimp into the U.S. and Israel agenda of finding an excuse to go to war against Iran. Now, if you are my age, you remember 3 Mile Island, you remember Chernobyl, and pretty much everybody here remembers Fukushima. Hanford, WIP. And we know what it's like to just sort of be wondering, is there radiation in the air that's going to give me cancer, cause birth defects in my children? And it's terrible when it happens by accident. But what kind of monster sets out to cause that deliberately? Because these computer weapons deployed against Iran could have easily triggered a nuclear accident. at these facilities, resulting in a wide area leak of highly radioactive material. Meanwhile, Iran has successfully placed their domestically made Fajr satellite into orbit and has an expected lifespan of 1.5 years. Basically, it's a photo reconnaissance satellite. And Israel's already out there screaming, see, it proves Iran can launch nuclear weapons around the world, ignoring the fact that Iran doesn't seem to have nuclear weapons, nor has it actually been caught trying to build them. Down in the Falklands, apparently 300 extra troops are being sent there. The islands are on their highest state of alert in almost 20 years. I mean, the last Falkland War was a disaster for both sides, politically, public relations, financial. But we seem to be in this kind of a mindset where everybody's looking for an excuse to uncork on everybody else here. Now, over in Europe, they're still reacting to the moves by the new Greek government to basically repudiate the odious debt placed on them by the European Central Bank. And up until now, the EU has had kind of a unanimous space on the hard line of Greece will pay this, we don't care where the debt came from. But apparently, France is now splitting off from the herd and is saying that they're prepared to support Greece's position in debt renegotiations. And they're recognizing Greece has a right to renegotiate the debt. Greece has a right to point out that much of that debt was created by fraud by their government, and that therefore the people should not be responsible for that. So we may be looking at the beginning of the split up of the European Union. There's another article over here in Blacklisted News. Chaos, fear, panic descend on EU's hallowed halls of power. They can't think of a way to get out of this mess. They have to hold a hard line with Greece, or the rest of Europe is going to want debt reduction. But holding the hard line with Greece may force them to leave the European Union. Either which is going to be triggering major financial upheaval. We got to take ourselves another commercial break here. I know we got a caller waiting on the line. We're going to get to you as soon as we come back from these commercials. Hello, hi, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we take this phone call, I want to get to this story. Croatia has just written off the debts of 60,000 of their poorest citizens. Now, this amounts to less than 1% of the entire debt, but they're hoping it will stimulate the economy. I think it's a token gesture, because in all probability, these debts could not have been repaid by these people who are in serious trouble because of the ECB. And let's be honest, this is a segment of society unlikely to start new businesses to move the economy forward. The plan would actually have merit if the debts of the middle class were being erased. But they aren't. All right, we're going to grab ourselves a phone call here. Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Yeah, speaking of the debt, I want everybody to watch that video you have on your site with the 12-year-old girl from Canada.
Yes.
Talking about the Canadian bank. That tells you all you need to know.
Well, it's the same message we've been saying to everybody, and I'm glad that young people are picking up on it. These private central banks are not in business to serve the people in the nation. They exist to serve themselves, and they have become fabulously wealthy by corrupting the civil government in every nation in which they operate to game the system so that wealth just flows to them through the simple device of issuing all the public currency as a loan at interest.
Hey, Mike, I wanted to talk about ISIS. I think it's all like I think we're all being played somehow. They got to be some kind of mercenary group.
I'm sure they are. Of course it's a fraud. I mean, as we pointed out with that story about, what's going on here. France votes to support Palestinian statehood, and there's a ISIS terror attack. Japan sends all this money to Palestine to rebuild, and then their people get kidnapped and killed. It doesn't make sense unless ISIS is a completely manufactured adversary the way Al-Qaeda was, and the U.S. is just supporting them and popping them in all these countries and saying, oh, we have to invade this country to get ISIS, and no, we're not really invading Iraq and Syria, it's just that's where ISIS is. And from now on, any place that the United States wants to attack, ISIS will appear there. I'm waiting for ISIS to show up in Iran now.
It's just you see them driving like brand new Toyota trucks built in Texas for special forces, our special forces. I mean, it just, you can see it's a fraud and they're being used for, to our advantage.
No, absolutely. And it is. It's another lie by a government that gets what it wants from the people with more and more lies. They finally realized that screaming that, this leader has nuclear weapons or sarin gas doesn't work any longer, so they had to create a new uber enemy with which to terrify us with. But we're catching on to that one as well.
And, Mike, I just wanted, I don't know if you're going to mention this when you do the economy segment about the Baltic Dry Index.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
I'll just have you, I'll have you do that.
All right. Yeah, I was looking at the numbers earlier today. All right. Thanks an awful lot for the phone call. We're going to let you go here. Let's see. Over at shtfplan.com, we're on the verge of a crisis, and these global currency wars are triggering it. Everybody's trying to drive their currency down lower than all the other nations to keep export businesses working, keep tourism attractive. And in that context, the U.S. is losing it because the dollar is staying up, and they may be caught in a trap. They can't let the dollar go down without everybody accelerating the move away from the dollar. And so now, as all these other currencies are dropping, they're really caught between a rock and a hard place here. Meanwhile, story out of the New American, apparently Israel, our only friend in the Middle East, is now planning free trade with Russia and China. And I don't think they're going to be going through the dollar. So Israel sees what's happening. They see what the future is going to be. They're already bailing on the U.S. You can't give us any more, we're done with you. Just, U.S. is a dried out husk. They're going to drop it and go to some other country. Canada, Europe. Anyway, what the Dustin was saying here, the Baltic Dry Index is plunging at its fastest pace since the Lehman collapse. It is down to 590. March of last year, it was at 1,600. Now it's at 590. And it's not far from the all-time record low of 554 set in July 1986. And this is a solid indicator of manufacturing and retail in this country. Because if people aren't buying, manufacturers aren't manufacturing, they don't need raw materials, they cancel orders. That's what the Baltic Dry Index measures. How much raw materials are being brought to the factories that supply America's retail establishment here. Very interesting article, again from shtfplan.com. Consumption crashes in December. The country has clearly entered recession. And it's important to look at all these indicators. Because, over at the Dow, the plunge protection team stepped in at the last minute and drove the Dow up to 196. Huzzah, huzzah. See, the economy's doing really good. Well, if the Dow is going up, and the consumer price index is going down, and the Baltic Dry Index is going down, there's a disconnect there. And it underscores the fact that the stock market is being rigged to keep the money junkies happy and to use as a political banner. But the point of this article is that the real indicators are flashing red warning signals, and corporate media and the government is saying, oh, the economy's in recovery, everything's fine, we've got plenty of money to spend on wars. Consumer spending this last December collapsed at the greatest rate in the last 5 years, despite the holiday shopping season. Speaking of the holiday shopping season, bad news from Radio Shack. As you know, they had already announced they were going to close half of their stores. And apparently Radio Shack, as part of its bankruptcy proceedings, is going to sell the rest of their stores to Sprint. And after this is all done, the name Radio Shack is going to disappear from the retail landscape. The stores will all be rebranded as Sprint stores, which makes sense because Radio Shack had been pushing a lot of Sprint products all along, and less actual pieces to build radios with. I'm working on a small project of my own related to radio astronomy, and I can't get the parts at Radio Shack. I had to order everything off of eBay. to build just this little tiny line amplifier for an antenna. Now here's an article over in Der Spiegel, looking for lessons in Iceland's recovery. And they're talking honestly about how Iceland's economy has improved tremendously since 2008. I mean, they suffered one of the most dramatic crashes caused by the mortgage-backed security fraud implosion. And they threw their crooked bankers in jail. They wrote off much of the debt. They replaced their government, and things are going well. And Der Spiegel is saying, are there lessons we should be paying attention to? And, of course, what we're going to get from the private central bankers is, no, don't look at Iceland. Iceland is bad. Private central banks are good. Wall Street is good. Austerity is good. Iceland is bad. Ooh, Iceland. They don't want you even aware of alternatives out there because they're afraid you're going to look at it and say, there might actually be a different model to follow than private central banks issuing all the currency as a loan at interest. They don't want you to even know it's out there. That's why when the Federal Reserve Act was passed back in 1913, public schools stopped teaching about King George III's Currency Act as being a prime cause of the revolution. Don't want you thinking that there's alternatives out there. You're a heretic if you think there are alternatives to private central banks. It's going to burn you at the stake. All right, we're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, there's a very interesting article. This is being reported by Reuters. U.S. companies face billions in Venezuela currency losses, Reuters analysis shows. And they're basically talking about there are 40 major U.S. companies that have significant exposure to the drop in value of Venezuela's currency because of their deepening economic crisis, which has been exacerbated by the slump in world oil prices. And they're warning these companies could collectively be forced to take billions of dollars of write-downs, or possibly even try and cash in their credit default swaps. And it's sort of underscoring an important issue. The downside of all this push to globalism, especially economic globalism, is that anything the U.S. government does to mess with other countries inevitably causes equivalent harm here. There's no isolation anymore. U.S. makes a deal with Saudi Arabia to crush oil prices to harm Russia, and it harms Canada, harms the U.S., harms Europe, harms Venezuela. The Venezuela economic crash comes back to harm U.S. companies. And they never think these things all the way through. There's an interesting video interview. Wilkerson interviewed on Russia Today, and he's saying basically it has been a long, long time since we've actually had a president who understands foreign affairs and the international game of politics. And he goes on to say that basically the current White House and its predecessors aren't dealing with reality. They're caught up in these dreams of glory coming from the neocons about the new American empire and how we will bestride the world. And they keep making these really, really bad calls. That's absolutely true here. Now, there's an article over at Zero Hedge. Here's some frightening honesty courtesy of the U.S. Congress. And they're talking about a bill that was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives last week, Resolution number 41. And it got zero coverage in the corporate media for a very good reason. This bill essentially lays out that the federal government is broke and cannot pay its bills. And looking at this Resolution 41, it's basically saying that the U.S. federal government, which actually allowed and actually encouraged that 2008 mortgage-backed security fraud that emptied all these state and private pension funds, is not responsible. It's not our place to bail out these pension funds. And the resolution says these pension funds are going to have to solve their economic losses by restructuring, which is federal government speak for the people who are on those pension funds aren't going to be paid what they were promised. And remember, Congress recently passed another law saying that pension funds can renege on their commitments to the people who've paid into those pension funds. So the short version is, for people who are retired, who are living on a pension fund, you're about to get clubbed, use a polite word for it, with the blessing and permission of the federal government. Now, as you know, Obamacare is coming up for a bit of a pitched battle in the new U.S. Congress, and the first round appears to be underway. Apparently, 18 Democrats have broken ranks with the president to join the GOP for a measure to restore a 40-hour work week as the definition of full-time under Obamacare. Now, remember when Obamacare first came out and there were all these hideous costs that were just going to kill small businesses. And so these small businesses moved all their 40-hour work week people to 39 hours. At which point Obama got out his pen on his desk and said, I hereby, Obama the first, declare that a full-time work week is anything above 30 hours. To just force everybody to sign on to that disaster called Obamacare, and now it looks like Congress is going to go back and say, no, it's 40. 40 hours a full-time work week. And they really should hold Obama to account for his illegal, unconstitutional changing of the law from his desk, because he's not allowed to do that. Now, here's a very bizarre story that came out of CNN. John McCain stands by Sarah Palin. Because Palin is out there considering throwing her hat into the ring for 2016. And John McCain is apparently standing next to her saying, oh, yes, she's still got a strong base of support. She can make a run for the White House. And all I can figure is McCain must have a serious case of the hots for Sarah Palin to stand by her today, since she's pretty much the main reason he lost in 2008. She was just this joke. Now, of course, McCain isn't all that popular right now, and maybe this is his way of getting revenge. Because his name is not star power any longer. Now, we were talking last week about how the New York Police Department has set up this strategic reaction force armed with tanks, body armor, and machine guns to deal with the crisis, and how they were going to be deployed against large protests, to wag the machine guns at them, to intimidate them. Well, that provoked a tremendous public backlash, and the New York Police Department has now reversed itself, and they're saying that this anti-terror unit with the machine guns will not be policing protesters. Now, of course, they can say that, but as long as that unit is in existence, they can be deployed at a moment's notice. Oh, those gosh darn Occupy Wall Street people are back. Go over there and scare them back into their homes. Scare the slaves back into their slave pens. Can't have these uppity Americans thinking that this is a democracy anymore here. Speaking of police, story coming out of filmingcops.com. This is over in San Bernardino County. Apparently, a man was stopped riding his bicycle just after he'd left his kids off at school. And he was stopped by the police, who had a report of a suspicious black man trying to break into a house. And apparently this guy was not that suspect, but somehow an altercation broke out between the police and this man, Dante Parker. And they tased him 27 times. Needless to say, he died. And this is not a black on white or white on black racial issue. They'd like you to think it is. This is an issue of the police forces of the United States of America being let loose to terrorize and intimidate and repress the American people. That's what this is really all about. That's why you're seeing all this brutality directed against the American people, and the police who carry out these crimes are basically let off with a wrist slap, if even that. And that is the real issue. Used to be to protect and to serve. Today it's, we treat you like a king, as in Rodney King. Meanwhile, over in Great Britain, David Cameron is pledging to ban all untraceable messaging apps from smartphones, tablets, computers. You're not allowed to communicate with anybody unless the government knows who you are, who you're communicating with, what the content of the message is. It's all part of the Snoopers Charter, which went down to defeat, and they're already in there trying to get it passed again. They got to be really afraid of ordinary law-abiding citizens to be pushing for this degree of surveillance. Because we already know real criminals and real terrorists aren't going to use the normal apps and the normal websites and the normal chains of communication because they know it's being watched. This is about watching you, to intimidate you, to scare you into silent obedience. And at least around here, it's not working. It's making us more and more angry. Now, remember Stephen Saleta? He was a tenured professor at the University of Illinois who was fired over tweets that he made on his own time criticizing Israel's actions in Gaza. There's been a new development on that story, and we will give it to you when we come back from the news break. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Hour number 2, phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is still in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. So before the news break, we were talking about Stephen Saleta, who was a tenured professor at the University of Illinois, who was fired from his position because in his private life off campus, he posted some tweets critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. And needless to say, Israel's minions in Illinois immediately mounted a campaign. Oh, you have to fire this person. We will make sure your, donations get cut off. We'll do all that unless you... And unfortunately, the chancellors of the University of Illinois knuckled under and fired him. Well, the new development is that Stephen Saleta has filed a civil rights lawsuit against the University of Illinois, saying that his firing violated his First Amendment right to free speech, and it did, along with basic principles of academic freedom. Now, in an honest court system, this guy's going to win, because the tweets in question were part of his private life. He did not express his opinion on this subject while he was on campus. And if Stephen wins this case, and there is a huge settlement, the floodgates are going to open, and Israel is going to find itself facing the reality of a nation where freedom of speech has been reaffirmed. And that First Amendment says, yeah, we have a right to criticize Israel's actions to the same degree with which we criticize our own government. Isn't that a weird double standard that we've seen in the United States recently? We can criticize our own government all we want, but oh boy, you criticize the government of Israel, you're going to be in trouble. So I hope he wins this lawsuit. I hope there is an absolutely devastating payout to set the precedent for other universities not to allow outsiders working on behalf of a foreign government to come in and say what may be said or not said by their professors in their private lives. Again, if Stephen had done this on campus, I would see some merit in his firing, but this was his private life. And I'm sure Israel did this to try and terrorize other university professors into staying silent in their private lives. And this is the pushback here. Now, interesting story over at Ex Republic TV. U.S. judges see epidemic of prosecutorial misconduct in state. We're seeing stories like this pop up all over the place. And I put it up here to sort of underscore an article that appeared over on Russia Today. It's actually a YouTube video talking about the record number of U.S. prisoners being exonerated. Wow, all of a sudden there's a flood of people who were locked up being let go. And they should have headlined it, record number of Americans are being wrongfully convicted because of the aforesaid prosecutorial misconduct. And this is why, all kidding about tar and feathers aside, I cannot support the death penalty because we know our justice system is not just. People are sent to prison who do not deserve to be there. Back in the 1990s, there was a huge epidemic of men who were sent to prison for the crime of rape. And later on, they were proven innocent by DNA tests, and the National Organization of Women were out there saying, you can't use DNA tests. It's undermining the credibility of the victims. You're blaming the victims again. Well, yeah, we are if they lied. If you put somebody in prison and you find out after the fact that they were actually innocent, you can let them go. You can compensate them for the lost years of their life, the lost opportunities, pay for the medical bills resulting from anything infectious they picked up inside that prison. But once you execute somebody, that's it. And I know they made a big deal about how this guy who was executed 70 years ago was retroactively exonerated, and it doesn't help him. Until we can restore life to those it is wrongfully taken from, we shouldn't take it in the first place. Because the reality is, this system does make mistakes. People are wrongfully convicted for crimes, for political reasons, for career ambition, outright ineptness. There was a story here about how this judge, when the jury pool was emptied at his courtroom, he ordered the cops to go out and just grab people off the street, make them sit on the jury. I don't think that's going to be a fair, impartial trial. They might just say he's guilty, send him to jail just to get out of there. Anyway. Now, as you've probably been hearing, the U.S. military and the CIA are running into a bit of a retention problem regarding drone pilots. More and more of them are quitting. They're taking a serious look at what it is they're doing. They're not happy with it, and they're saying, I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. So they're trying to find new drone pilots. And where the U.S. military is recruiting are video game conventions. The recruiters are out there at the video game conventions, and they're looking for the really highly skilled game players and saying, how would you like a career in the United States military? And I hope those kids are smart enough to realize that what they're being asked to do isn't a computer game. There's no reset button. When they blow somebody to bloody bits, they don't get up and reset and go back to square one. It's pretty much permanent. Anyway. Now, we have been talking about how totally over-the-top schools have become regarding opposition to terror and suspending kids for nibbling a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Suspended another kid for saying that he'd wish he'd had a gun during a recent mass shootings because he could have saved the people. Oh, no, you can't talk about guns. Gun keychains, things like that. Here's where it gets even more bizarre. A fourth grader got suspended from school for claiming he had the One Ring from the Hobbit movies. This actually happened. Now, make-believe is part of growing up. And I would hope that those teachers and those administrators at school understand there really is not a One Ring to rule them all. It's make-believe. And they're suspending a kid for playing make-believe games about the One Ring. What are they doing to our kids? They're stifling their creativity. They're grading them on behavior rather than achievement. Traumatizing them with these unannounced school shooting drills. And they're not exactly feeding them very well either with this Michelle Obama lunch scandal going on. What are they trying to do to the kids? What is the next generation of Americans going to look like, act like, think like, feel like with this kind of heavy-handed propaganda going on here? Now, with Israel struggling to maintain its victim status, it was perhaps not unexpected that there's been what appears to be another hate crime hoax, basically a Jewish fraternity, Alpha Epsilon Pi, was found decorated with swastikas, and it's anti-Semitism at its worst. Well, I don't know. Outside of Israel's supporters, nobody cares about the swastika anymore. And certainly anti-Semites wouldn't have realized it was a high holy day. Nobody wants to be the Nazis unless they're paid to be Nazis. They're the bad guys. They lost. Nobody says, I want to historically recreate the side that lost. It's just not human nature. And I think if they actually catch the perpetrators, it'll turn out to be another hoax, like we saw at Claremont, like we saw at Georgetown University. We'll be right back. Hello, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about these hate crime hoaxes and how in the past so many of them have turned out to be hoaxes. And there's a very fundamental reason why we should presume these are hoaxes, because except for Israel and its supporters, World War II it's history. Happened before we were born. Don't care about the swastika. Now, a little bit of common sense here. When you were a kid and you played cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians, you wanted to be the cops. You wanted to be the good guys. You wanted to be the cowboys. You know, you'd make the little kids play the robbers and the Indians because we want to be on the side that wins. Well, I hate to break this to you. Nazi Germany lost World War II. And people don't grow up wanting to be them. Very often they're paid to be them. There was a huge scandal back in the late 1930s, as a matter of fact. There was an American Nazi Party. And they had a membership that numbered in the ones. But they got a lot of media coverage. Oh, the Nazis are here. The Nazis are here. And then the guy who was running it all got arrested for embezzling from his primary financial backer that turned out to be the Anti-Defamation League. If it wasn't for Israel, World War II would be fading into oblivion in history. Like World War I. If you want to study it, you've got it. It's there, but it's not just being maintained as part of the public consciousness. So, but Israel's out there desperate to prove they're the victims, they're suffering. We're sick of hearing about it. Sick of crying wolf or nuclear duck. Anyway. Now, last week we were talking about this story coming out of Comcast, where there was somebody who was trying to cancel their Comcast service, and Comcast has become notorious for the roadblocks it puts in the way of anybody wanting to end their service. Actually, probably just faster to stop the bill and they'll turn it off, but then it goes on your credit report. And apparently when this guy called in and said, I want to cut off my service, he was routed through to one of the retention specialists. They got into a shouting match. And apparently this retention specialist edited the account so that the customer got his next bill. It was addressed to Sphincter Brown. And I'm using a polite word for what was actually there. Comcast has now apologized, but still refuses to cancel his service. Speaking of Comcast, as you know, there's this huge debate regarding a merger between Time Warner Cable and Comcast. And members of Congress who are looking at this are being inundated with letters saying, oh yes, this is a good idea. This is going to improve service and quality, and I don't think so, not from what we're hearing. Well, it turns out somebody has twigged onto the fact that Comcast is actually producing most of these letters. And this comes under the heading of grassroots lobbying. There are companies around Washington, D.C., where this is all they do. They've got an office with all these little cubby holes in the wall with different kinds of stationery, with flowers and butterflies and kittens or whatever. And they have printers that have all the different fonts on them. So they'll print up all these letters supporting an agenda. They have software that uniquifies each letter, makes it look like it's spontaneously written by a carbon-based life form. And then they'll take all these letters and put them together, and then they'll drive around town dropping them in different mailboxes around the town, so the postmarks don't give them away. And this is considered a legitimate and legal form of lobbying Congress. Except, of course, that the members of Congress, when they come into their desk and there's a huge stack of mail, they have no way of knowing it originated in a single office. It really is very underhanded, but is still legal. And apparently somebody's come forward to say that Comcast is doing that right now with members of Congress and the FCC, who are in charge of this decision, whether to allow the merger or not. All righty. Now then, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Groundhog Day, Puxatawny Phil came out, saw his shadow, 6 more weeks of winter, then he bit the mayor. He may be a fur hat before the end of the week because of that one here. Now, the reality is, let's look at some of the headlines. 12160, trucks banned from major turnpikes in Cleveland due to icy conditions. A lot of black ice out there. A lot of accidents taking place. Story out of ABC. Heavy snow hits the Midwest. Next, a messy Monday commute for millions. PressandGuide.com. Snow emergencies declared in Dearborn and Dearborn Heights. Story out of Battle Creek Inquirer. 14 inches of snow falls on Calhoun County. They're actually calling it the Super Bowl storm over at WZZM, Channel 13. Super Bowl storm dumps as much as 20 inches of snow. Over at Freep.com, Metro Detroit digs out from area's 3rd biggest snow storm ever. And it's stories like this that have Newsmax asking, is global warming another lie and a ripoff? And yes, it is. And the climate scientists who've made all this money out of screaming about human-caused global warming, anthropocentric global warming. Now they're rebranding. They're trying to rebrand because they're realizing the winters are getting harder. They're calling it anthropocentric climate disruption. It's not the sun changing output. It's human activity is causing changes to climate. And they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here because if the world is getting warmer, then taxing and controlling carbon maybe makes sense if you believe that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warms the world, which even NASA is saying, no, it acts like a coolant. But if the weather is getting cooler, then this whole idea that carbon dioxide heats up the planet tells you we should let the carbon dioxide go and mitigate the new ice age. So they're thrashing around still trying to find some way they can say that all this snow and ice is the fault of human carbon dioxide and we can tax it. And they're getting kind of silly out there. Here's an interesting story. This is in Time magazine, no less. Climate change is making the land in Iceland rise. And they're saying because the glaciers are melting in Iceland, it reduces pressure on the land, and the land is rising. Remember when they told us that global warming was going to lead to coastlines being flooded? Now they're saying, oh no, global warming, the land goes up now. And more about this when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're talking about this story that appeared in Time magazine about how global warming is making Iceland rise. Now remember, not too long ago they insisted global warming meant that coastal areas would be flooded. And they were checking the sea levels around Iceland and seeing them kind of go down. And so the new explanation is that human-caused global warming is melting the Icelandic glaciers, and that makes Iceland a little bit lighter, and it's springing up from underneath. And that's not an entirely unknown geological process. But they're still out there saying, you know, they'd love to point to Iceland's glaciers melting. See, proves human-caused global warming. Pay no attention to the couple of dozen active volcanoes that are there underneath all that ice. You know, volcanoes, that's nothing. It's, you know, they're the only reason those glaciers are melting, it's human activity. They're really raising on a busted flush on this story here. Story out of the New York Times again. Climate change is bottom line. This one actually is poking fun at what's going on. And they're talking about Greg Page, who's executive chairman of Cargill, decided he had to do a speech about human-caused global warming. It would be irresponsible not to contemplate him. contemplate that. Of course, it happened to be 8 degrees in Minneapolis on the time, and he was bundled up in a wool sports coat over a zip-up sweater. Here's an article out of the Telegraph in Great Britain, ClimateGate, the sequel, how we are still being tricked with flawed data on global warming. And this goes back to the claim that we saw in the week before the State of the Union speech about how 2014 was the hottest year on record, according to NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And they put out a chart that said, see, the temperatures are going up and it's never been hotter than this. Well, this reporter decided he wanted to look at that. And he obtained the raw temperature data that NASA's GIS insisted showed 2014 was the hottest year on record. And actually found that the raw data confirms the Earth is cooling. But, of course, it has to be statistically adjusted and seasonally modified. And it's all a fancy name for just rigging the data to get the results you want. Which is why those of us on the inside have always said that NASA actually means never a straight answer. Anybody who says there's no such thing as a wide-ranging conspiracy against the people, we got one. Staked out, naked on the ground for you to study and learn from, because the human-caused global warming fraud is a conspiracy, and it involved former Vice President Al Gore, NASA, NOAA, the United Nations, the IPCC, Penn State, Hadley CRU, Australia's Bureau of Meteorology. They all hopped on board because they were all going to get lots and lots of money from carbon credits and carbon taxes. And now they're stuck with it. They can't back off and say, we were wrong or we lied. They've all welded their personal reputations and finances to perpetuating this hoax, and that's why they keep on going. Over at the Daily Sheeple, they've got an article, despite all the snow, Barack Obama's sick obsession with climate change rages on. Barack Obama continues to insist that global warming is the greatest threat that humanity is facing. Actually, the greatest threat humanity is facing is an out-of-control global nuclear war being brought about by U.S. foreign policy relative to Russia and China. They won't give up. Alrighty, a couple of breaking headlines. Apparently, Ukraine's paramilitary Avdar battalion has stormed the Ministry of Defense in Kiev. We've been hearing for quite some time that sections of Kiev's military are breaking off and no longer view Poroshenko as a legitimate ruler, which is easy to say. So that may be coming apart over there as well. I got a follow-up email from somebody regarding this swastika on the fraternity house. Now, this happened at UC Davis, and the fraternity is an off-campus fraternity. And apparently these swastikas appeared just after the Associated Students of UC Davis passed an advisory resolution asking the UC regents to divest from businesses with connections to Israel. So that's the reason. Oh, you've got to support Israel because the Nazis are out there. The Nazis are going to get you. They've really worn this one out, but they don't really have anything else, do they? Alrighty, apparently Tom Frieden, director of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, partnering with Barack Obama, are now saying, everybody has to get the measles vaccine because there's a large outbreak of measles coming. There was actually somebody they had on Fox News earlier today saying that really the decision whether or not to vaccinate, that should be made by the government and not the individual. Chris Christie, who's starting to angle his bid for 2016, came out with the opposite point of view. It really is a personal decision. Because if I am sitting here in a room full of vaccinated people, how am I going to get measles? if I don't have a vaccine? How will I give it to them if the vaccine works? And, of course, that's really the big problem. Not only does the measles vaccine not appear to work, it appears to actually be causing the illness. And now there's confirmation from the CDC itself that if you get the measles vaccine, you can give measles to everybody around you. It's called building your market, building your customer base, because our medical industrial complex cannot survive if the American people are actually healthy. Their entire business model requires the American people be chronically ill all the time. Now, apparently up in Canada, they had a research study that found that not only is this season's flu shot less effective than anybody was claiming, but actually seems to increase the possibility that you will get the flu. In other words, if you get the flu shot, you are more likely to come down with the flu. And now there's media's doing a full court press. No, you have to get the vaccine because these pharmaceutical companies are big sponsors. And if we don't support mandatory vaccines for everybody, they'll take their commercials someplace else. Now, here's a very interesting article. This was published in the Daily Mail in Great Britain. And it has to do with what are called the superbugs, the newly evolved pathogens that are resistant to antibiotics. And it's a big problem. You come down with one of these bugs, they'll pump you full of antibiotics. Those aren't working, let's try the other one. Well, those aren't working, let's try the other one. And there's been a new development there. Because now they're saying, oh, amazingly enough, if we add nanosilver to our antibiotics, suddenly they're 1,000 times more effective against the antibiotic-resistant germs. I don't think so. I think it's the silver. They're trying to co-opt and hijack nanosilver. We'll be right back with more on the subject. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and we're talking about nanosilver or colloidal silver. Now, following the Ebola outbreak last year, the World Health Organization said to deal with this crisis, unconventional, unproven therapies could be tried. And in at least one of the countries in Africa, they started using nanosilver because there was a shortage of the other approved drugs, and they got some good results. And almost immediately here in the United States, the FDA started coming down on anybody producing and selling nanosilver products if they dared say that it was useful against germs and viruses. And we found a report from the United States Air Force's own laboratory saying that nanosilver was effective against hemorrhagic fevers, including Ebola. Now, the big pharmaceutical corporations have been trying to ban colloidal silver. They did succeed for a while, but public demand brought it back. But there are limits on the potency of what you buy in the local health food store. There's a limit on it. It's a very dilute form of colloidal silver. They don't want it to really appear to be working here. So now all of a sudden, the big pharmaceutical companies are dealing with the fact that all of their very expensive antibiotics are no longer effective because the germs keep evolving. The viruses keep evolving. And so now they're announcing that adding colloidal silver to the antibiotics, it boosts their effectiveness by 1,000 times. Huzzah, huzzah. I think they need to start testing silver by itself, but they won't do that because what's going on here is they want to hijack nanosilver and make it part of their product. You're still going to be paying for the antibiotics. It's going to have nanosilver in there at a huge markup. And I'm going to make a little bit of a prognostication here that there is going to be a push for a law banning dispensing of nanosilver without a doctor's prescription, so the doctor will prescribe you nanosilver with stuff added to it at a huge boost in price from big pharmaceuticals. They know it works. They just want to make sure they're the ones who profit from it. Amazingly dishonest here. And, of course, we make our own nanosilver here. We do not sell it, because that would involve all kinds of nasties from the FDA. We'll give it away. We've given it away to family and friends. Don't start sending in emails asking me for bottles, because I can't afford to give huge amounts of it away. But that's the whole point here. It's something you can make in your own home. It's something communities can make. We're not dependent on big pharmaceutical corporations for something that actually works. And they've known it works all along. When brand new babies are born, what do you think is in those drops that they put into the eyes immediately? It's nanosilver. The approved burn ointment streams, nanosilver in there. They know it does work. They just don't want you to know it, because you can make it yourself. Here's a very alarming story. This is over in the Mirror in Great Britain. And apparently there is a push by health authorities and social services to have this mother of 6 forcibly sterilized against her will. Kick down the door, grab her, throw her on a gurney, take her to the hospital, have her sterilized. She's in her 30s, and the authorities are saying she should not be allowed to get pregnant again with her partner, because it'll put her life at risk. And she lacks the mental capacity to make decisions about medical treatment, and that is the dangerous precedent they're trying to set. That if you make a decision for your own medical care that they don't agree with, that they have the right to come in and force you to be sterilized, to take a vaccine. Very alarming trend here. And it wouldn't be an issue except for all the growing body of evidence that the latest offerings from big pharmaceutical companies are not only not effective, they're actually harmful. In many cases, they're still putting mercury-based thimerosal as a preservative. And you need to remember, the Homeland Security Act that created the Department of Homeland Security and the crotch gropers over at the airport included a provision that permanently, legally indemnified vaccine makers from civil lawsuits resulting from harm caused by their product. They have a license to put whatever they want in there. Shoot it into your arm. If you suffer harm from it, can't be sued. Now, we saw that kind of indemnification given to the computer hardware and software industry back in the 80s, and look at how abusive it got. And now we're talking about pharmaceutical companies making vaccines that get injected into your body being given the same immunity. Now, Minnesota's largest school district, Anoka-Hennepin, are going to start mandatory screenings for high school students for depression and anxiety in order to strongly recommend to the parents what prescription psychiatric medications they should buy and give to their children. And again, that is something that should be up to the parents. High schoolers get depressed. The high school experience can be depressing. They get anxieties. Am I going to pass this test? Those are normal reactions. And they want to get those kids on the prescription medication treadmill. And the reason we should be concerned over and above the abuse of authority and presumption into the rights of parents is the very long history of these medications triggering acts of extreme violence, suicide, mass murder. All right. Article out of fastcompany.com, and it's headlined, Why a Fake Article Titled for Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs Was Accepted by 17 Medical Journals. And they're talking about the fact that a lot of so-called scientific journals are outright frauds. They have names that seem very, very similar to the recognized journals. But you can get an article published in them simply by paying a fee, $500. And there is an epidemic of companies that will write up some kind of scientific journal article that says, my product is good for you and the other guy's product is bad for you. They'll pay the money to get them published in the journal, and then they'll say in their advertising, as published in the journal of whatever. And it's a huge, huge problem, because ordinary people like you and I when we're reading this stuff in the ads. We don't know if it's a legitimate, recognized, acknowledged journal for the industry or one of these fake vanity publishing houses. So this guy just made up an article. Completely nonsense. And he succeeded in getting it published in 17 of these vanity journals. Apparently one of them was being run out of the offices of a car wash. You have to ask, where's the federal government in all of this? Because isn't the federal government supposed to be keeping an eye on scams perpetrated against the American people? Apparently not in this case. Not in this case at all. And even within the legitimate, recognized journals, there's a growing problem of articles being published and then being rescinded down the road for being found to be fraudulent. But of course, the people committing the fraud, they'll publish that their article was published in the journal of whatever, and they just won't mention the fact that it was discredited later on. And it's something like 30 to 40% of these articles in the legit journals are eventually recalled for research fraud. It's a huge problem, and it gets back to the comment I made before that this lust for stacks of ink and paper has destroyed what used to be the best qualities of the American people. People will do anything for funding, for a fast buck. Oh yes, the world is getting warmer. It's all the fault of people. Really, that sun's got nothing to do with it. The volcanoes underneath the ice pack on Iceland, they've got nothing to do with the glaciers melting. It's all human activity. It's the golden rule of science. Whoever's got the gold decides the science, to the detriment of society as a whole. I never thought I would live to see the United States of America as low as it has become in terms of its ethics and its morality. We got to take a break for commercial news breaks. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open. 877-300-7645. 877-300-7645. We have some developing stories here. Earlier in the program, we were talking about how one of the Kiev paramilitary militias has now surrounded and entered the Defense Ministry building. Apparently, all is not well in the land of the junta. And now we're hearing a story coming out of coalsteelguru.com where Ukraine's coal miners are demanding their back pay from Kiev. Some of them have not been paid in 6 months' time by the government in Kiev. So all this talk about the U.S. giving lethal arms to Kiev, it may be moot because Kiev may fall. What's the U.S. going to do? Go on in and kill the Kiev forces who refuse to do what they're told? Start murdering the coal miners for wanting to be paid for their work? It's very hard work being a miner, and it's dangerous, too. Now, over in Russia, Konstantin Kosachev, the chairman of the International Committee of Russia's Federation Council, has basically said U.S. supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine will escalate the conflict. Yeah, that's what the U.S. wants to happen. Meanwhile, Putin is out there saying it's time for everybody to quit the hostilities. Once again, Putin is out there proving he is the peacemaker and the statesman. He's the only adult right now in the room of international politics. Everybody else is out there just throwing tantrums and screaming like Netanyahu. And Putin's out there saying, let's stop this before it truly gets out of control. I'm sure that the neocons in the United States are going to see that as a sign of weakness. See, Putin's not willing to fight. We should push harder. Meanwhile, we were talking about the Ukrainian soldiers who have been cut off near Debaltsevo. And we're hearing that a lot of them are just deserting to the other side or just going to the Russian republics. They're now acknowledging 7,000 trapped Ukrainian soldiers. And They're on the verge of being completely surrounded, and it could happen within the next 24 hours. That will signal a catastrophic defeat for Kiev. And the people in western Ukraine, they're already fed up. This so-called fourth mobilization has hit a major roadblock. Less than half the young people being ordered to show up for conscription are doing so. Apparently out in the towns, the local governments are tearing down the conscription notices, just taking down the placards and signs and just throwing them away. Poroshenko, whose prior background was in businesses, many of them corrupt, seems to have assumed the presidency of Ukraine with this fairy tale that if you're the president, whatever you say, people will do. It doesn't work that way, especially in the modern world. A good leader is able to persuade his people to a course of action. It's impossible to compel them. Now, we just put up a page of pictures from liveleak.com. It's headlined, Effects of the Use of Phosphorus Munitions in the Donbass. And I'm going to warn you before you click the link, and there's a warning right on the page. These photos are very graphic, showing exactly what happens to human flesh under white phosphorus munitions. And remember, the only recognized legal use of white phosphorus is to generate smoke screens to either attack from or more usually retreat behind. It is a war crime to use white phosphorus on civilians. It is a war crime to drop white phosphorus onto residential areas because it's an incendiary. It'll just burn the place to the ground. And if it gets on you, there's nothing you can do. It just keeps on burning and burning deeper and deeper into the skin. That's what these photos show. And they're very upsetting to look at. I'm going to tell you right now. If you have a weak stomach, just pass over the link, take my word for it here. Now, over in Greece, there's a new development. Tsipras is refusing to rule out accepting Russian financial aid. Russia's rolling out the red carpet. They recognize an opportunity to tear the European Union apart, to kneecap NATO, and what they're doing is perfectly legal. They've told Greece, if Greece leaves the EU, the Russian food ban will no longer apply to them, and they're offering to basically give Greece financial aid to get out of this mess. Meanwhile, over in Great Britain, they're out there screaming, Greece is the greatest risk to the global economy. Well, actually, at the moment, it's a risk to the European economy. And if the European economy stumbles, that's a risk to the global economy. But you know something? All these globalist bankers set this system up. They wanted a single planet with a single global financial system underneath the rule of a single global private central bank. Remember what I said in the earlier segment. The downside of all this economic globalism is there isn't anything that you can do to another country that's in a vacuum. It comes back on you. So now they're out there screaming that Greece is a threat to the global economy and Greece is a new hub for international terror and all the other things, basically signaling that before Europe and the U.S. allow Greece to move over to Russia, they'll invade the place. They'll attack. Oh, ISIS is in Greece. ISIS is in Greece. We got to invade there here. Now, President Obama is already unveiling his latest budget. It is almost $4 trillion. And it openly and blatantly sails right past the spending limits that were put on federal government spending to try and get the debt under control. And so Obama's attitude is, we're hopelessly in debt, can't pay our bills, let's spend more. And most of the increase in spending is going to the war machine and Obama's pet projects. Amnesty for the immigration, human-caused global warming, Obamacare. It's amazing. Now, we all remember last year this whole scandal over the ignition switch in General Motors vehicles. And it was a scandal because GM knew it was a problem. There was a design flaw with the switch. And personally, I think it's embarrassing for the once mighty United States of America, the nation that put men on the moon, to be in a position of not being able to actually make an ignition switch that's reliable on the car. And even though the deadline for filing claims was this last week, they're expecting that there are still a lot of claims out there for people who suffered injury, accident, in some cases death, because of this defective General Motors ignition switch. They're expecting the claims to continue to rise. We can't make an ignition switch that works anymore. It really is very, very annoying. I'm going round and around with the charging cable on my wife's iPad. It keeps saying, this is not certified to work, and just refuses to. And it's the original Apple cable and Apple power supply. Our technology has become decadent. That's the word for it. It's decadent. It lacks elegance, simplicity, functionality, and durability. We'll be back after these words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And, of course, that little bump music is from In Times of War, written by my wife. And I think it's a very timely song right now, because the whole point of the song and the video we made from it is there are no real winners in these wars. Yeah, one side gets to wave a flag when it's all over, but everybody loses. Phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is sitting in the control room with nothing to do, so call on in and help him be busy here. Now, getting on back to human-caused global warming, because there's a major, major storm hitting the east coast of the United States of America right now. And all that snow is coming on down, which is upsetting to a lot of people. Puxatawny Phil says there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. I'm sure Al Gore's put out a contract on him for saying that here. Interestingly enough, as of 1 o'clock Eastern Time today, Boston set a new all-time record for snowiest 7-day period, 34.2 inches. The old record of 31 inches was set 19 years ago, in 1996. So, remember when they were saying, back in 2000, snowfalls are now a thing of the past. Human-caused global warming, snow and ice are going away. You'll never... Even last November, they were actually coming out there and saying there will be no more cold records being set. Wrong again. Story out of Madison.com. Sunny and cold Mondays on tap in the wake of the biggest snowstorm South Central Wisconsin has seen this season. Record snowfalls leave commuters in the cold. This is MSNBC. Talking about from Indiana to Maine. 69 million Americans are under winter storm warnings or advisories, blizzard warnings. Thousands of flights canceled, thousands without power, school closures. Yeah, snowfalls are a thing of the past. We buy that one here. Over at Fox 8, temperatures will near record lows tonight. Watch for icy roadways, and that is a concern. What they call the black ice, which is where snow will fall on a roadway, and because asphalt tends to get hot in the sun, it will melt and refreeze as solid glare ice. That's what we called it when I was a kid, glare ice. Now they call it black ice. Alrighty, getting on off to other stories here. Talking about the FDA. And the FDA has been passing a lot of laws and regulations. And now they're talking about updating the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, this is a bill which claims to have the laudable purpose of making sure the food that we eat is safe. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually do that. What the bill does is increase the traceability of food as it flows from garden to store to home. It is a huge regulatory burden on food manufacturers. And the large corporations can afford to comply. Smaller food producers, especially family farms, can't. It's a huge amount of paperwork. And now the Native American farmers on the reservations are starting to scream that this is discriminatory against them. And they're saying these agricultural rules are making it more difficult for them to stay in business as a food producer. But we have seen as the demonstrated agenda of the U.S. government to make all food production under the control of the giant corporations, to make us all dependent on these food corporations. And we know that despite proclamations by the FDA, what these food corporations are putting in our supermarkets isn't necessarily safe. It's just been tracked. But we know there's a lot of harmful chemicals and additives in there, and we know that despite all the tracking, foodborne illnesses are a reality, especially for food that takes a little too long to get from the warehouse to the store, especially if the freezer unit on the truck or the shipping container isn't working properly. And the net effect of this new round of regulatory burden is to shift the advantage away from small farmers and to the giant corporations. Now, speaking of Native Americans, they're kicking up a bit of a fuss because apparently the fracking boom near Chaco Canyon is threatening Navajo ancestral lands and people. And apparently they're very concerned about all the toxic chemicals in fracking fluid and the release of methane coming up on their lands, which is a real concern all over America. Now, up in Alberta, they recently had a 4.4 magnitude quake in the Fox Creek region. And Alberta's energy regulator is acknowledging this quake apparently was caused by hydraulic fracturing because they don't get earthquakes there. And if this is confirmed, if the epicenter of the quake was in one of the fracking injection sites, this will be the largest earthquake ever confirmed to result from fracking operations. And we know all over the United States of America, they're getting quakes around these fracking operations in areas with no prior history of fracking. And one of the most alarming things that we're seeing are the injection wells that are going down in the area of the New Madrid fault system. Now, for those of you who don't pay a lot of attention to geological history, it may surprise you to know that the biggest recorded earthquake in the United States of America did not happen in California or Alaska. It happened along the New Madrid fault, estimated at having been above 8.0. Now, fortunately, when it happened, it was a sparsely populated area. That's not the truth anymore. And they're drilling injection wells into the fault systems around there. They're playing with fire, literally. And again, this rush to make money seems to be overriding common sense at all levels of corporate and civil governance. They just want to make the stockholders happy for the next quarter, and they don't care what else goes on. More about this when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And getting on back to some of the science and engineering news here. The fact of the matter is Fukushima is still an issue. And we keep hearing modern pronouncements that completely undermine what was being said when the disaster was first unfolding. Oh, it's only steam hydrogen explosion. Well, yeah, there was radioactive release. The latest story is coming out of enenews.com, where the Japanese engineers who are in charge of this cleanup site are acknowledging that only some of Fukushima's melted fuel has cooled to be solid. There appears to be spontaneous fission taking place deep underground. There's been apparently at least one criticality event underneath the remains of reactor number 3. And they're saying that even the solidified cores can remelt without adequate cooling water. And that is a problem because they're pouring the water in there, it becomes heavily contaminated, and they don't know what to do with it. They have been trying for year after year after year to have some kind of a processing plant that would remove the radioactive contamination from the water so they could either reuse the water or dump it in the ocean. They can't just keep putting the same contaminated water back in there because that could lead to further fission taking place. So, a Russian corporation has stepped in saying they know how to build a water decontamination station for Fukushima, and it's based on technologies they pioneered following Chernobyl. And apparently experts from the Russian National Nuclear Corporation Rosatom will create a demo station at Fukushima to prove the technology works, at which point Japan can make a decision whether they want to buy this or not. So here we have Russia stepping in to solve a problem that Japan and the United States either couldn't solve or just didn't care to, because we know right now the United States, their focus is totally on building new weapons and bombing people and drones. We don't have time to clean up that radioactive mess. You know, we'll just put out a lot of advertising saying those General Electric reactors are perfectly safe and go on selling them to India, which, by the way, didn't work out all that well. And Russia, once again, is showing they have become a world leader. Putin's out there trying to make peace, first in Syria, now in Ukraine. Russia is building all these amazing things, new infrastructure for trade with China, maglev railroads. Do we even have one of those yet here in the United States? And now they're going to go on down and demonstrate they know how to decontaminate the water, which would stop it being poured into the Pacific Ocean, which is what they've been doing with up to this point. One of the ways you know an empire is falling is when they can no longer do what they used to do. When Rome began to crumble from too much debt, too much corruption, the first thing that happened is they stopped maintaining the roads and the aqueducts and the infrastructure. And it began to fall apart. And without adequate water, Rome had to be abandoned eventually. Without the roads, they couldn't police their empire. We're seeing that here in the United States of America. Our politicians are always willing to talk about repairing America's crumbled infrastructure. And they'll charge you money to do it, but at the last second, the money has to be spent on something else. You don't need me to tell you this. Just walk around your town, your community, your city, and just look at the cracks. Look at the water leaking up from the cracked water mains. Huge drought problem out in California, and it's a problem only because the western half of the United States is desert for the most part. And long ago, the United States made the commitment to a water management system out west that allowed it to bloom as agricultural land. And it's been allowed to decay and rot because the focus and the money is all toward war. We saw that in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, where the portions of the flood levees that collapsed were portions that had been partially repaired but never finished. And they ran out of sandbags to contain the damage because the sandbags had been commandeered and sent to Iraq to fill with sand and make temporary fortifications. When the government is totally focused on war, nothing else gets done. We can't manufacture things that we used to manufacture. All of our high-end electronics are made overseas now. Can't even make a decent car anymore. One that's safe and reliable, that whole GM switch. Planned obsolescence coming in there. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to go into some details. My wife has an iPad because the iPhone is too small. And we've been having problems getting it charged. Because we'll plug in the charger and we get a message from the iPad, this accessory is not certified for use with the iPad. And it'll refuse to use the cable and the charger. And the interesting part about it is it's the cable and charger that came with the iPad from Apple. And I understand what Apple did. They have all this software in there that's trying to check the accessories to make sure that you bought them from Apple. And if you go to your local office supply place, you're going to see all these bins full of cables for the iPad and the iPhone that are made third party. But if you buy them, there's a real risk there that your Apple product is simply going to refuse to use them. They're not our product. It's a piece of wire. It's just wire. On the official Apple cable that I have plugging my iPhone into the computer, every time it starts, do you trust this computer? Yes, the computer hasn't changed. What's going on here? And it seems that Apple's security is constantly monitoring the cable, and if there's the tiniest fluctuation in electricity, it'll assume it's on a different platform. Now, I don't know about the rest of the country, but here on the island of Oahu, the voltage at the wall outlets fluctuates quite a bit. And that seems to be tripping some of these issues off. Still trying to play catch-up to be able to get astronauts up to the International Space Station. And certainly America's weapons, which are still the most expensive in the world, just like our medical care, are also declining in quality. And the U.S. government arm twists other countries to buy our weapons as opposed to Russian and Chinese weapons. Just like they arm twist us to go to the orthodox medical establishment, even though the care is not that good. It's marketing by coercion. It's kind of like the mafia, if you think about it. You know, you buy our product or you're going to get in trouble. Speaking of trouble, apparently during January, last month, at least 6,100 people have been killed in Iraq. And yes, most of the casualties appear to be among ISIS. But that's a lot of people being killed in a country which supposedly the U.S. has already conquered. Now, not too long ago, there was a statement by an Israeli official claiming that President Obama has conceded to 80% of Iran's demands on the nuclear talks. Just Israel trying to derail this, and apparently now the White House is denying that, saying it's complete nonsense. They're still game playing, still trying to derail this thing. We got to take a break. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. We got two callers waiting on the line I'm going to get to in just a minute here. But before I do, apparently Rand Paul is coming down on the same side with Governor Chris Christie. Vaccines ought to be voluntary. And it's absolutely right. You should have a choice. But have you noticed lately in this country that if somebody comes out with a product that really isn't useful and nobody wants, all they got to do is bribe enough members of Congress and have it made mandatory. You will buy this. You will use this. And it's another hidden form of taxation because what little money the government allows you to keep, now they're telling you what you have to spend it on. All righty, we're going to grab some phone calls here. Thomas in San Francisco, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, hello. It's so good to talk to you again. Anyway, I go to your site every day. I can't believe how many things you post a day. I'm a news hound. I try to go through everything, but apparently I can't. But one thing that caught my attention, it was a few weeks ago. You posted something on the Franklin cover-up where Ted Gunderson was involved with the Bushes to supply the pedophile, the kids to the pedophiles. And I was blown away because I thought, Ted Gunderson was a nice guy or something. So I'm like fully confused.
Well, there can be a huge gap between public persona and private persona. I've had issues with Ted Gunderson in the past where he's made some claims about very exotic weapons that turned out to be less than accurate and more of a propaganda situation. So I don't remember the specific article you're referring to, and I'll do a little
I think it was something like Operation Brownstone or something Brown, where he was the one that carried out the operation to
I'll have to go look that up and clarify exactly what's going on here, because it doesn't ring a bell, and it could have been a member post, and sometimes I don't read all those all the way through because of the sheer volume of them. But I do know that the Franklin scandal, and the reason we keep hitting it, is we're dealing with behaviors by our ruling elite, which we really need to be aware of the kind of people they are. In fact, there's a story that was breaking just today where apparently, and this is being reported over in Russia Today, Commons Committee chairman in Great Britain published a whole bunch of emails about the child abuse scandal in Britain, including the names of the victims. And now they're all getting death threats from the friends of all these politicians, saying, you'd better shut up or we're going to get you. It was a very reckless and stupid thing to do, or maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was deliberate in order to bring pressure to bear on victims to just shut the heck up about what's going on. Okay?
Well, very good. Very good. Thank you very kindly, and thank you for your insight on that. So I guess I should probably just take that with a grain of salt.
Well, let me go back and take a look at it, because it doesn't ring a bell, and as you say, it was a few weeks ago, which for...
About like 3-4 weeks ago.
I'll hunt it down here. Thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to take one more phone call here. Arlette in New Jersey. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes, hi, Mike. First time. I love your show. Listen to it every day. And I was hearing you talk about the iPod and the problem with the wire.
Yes.
So somebody gave me a gift, and I have the same problem, exactly the same. And I unplugged it from the wire, and I turned it around the other way. Then I plugged it again, and it worked.
Yeah, we've noticed that on my wife's as well. The plug is supposed to be universal, can go in either way. But it works sometimes on one way and not at all on the other. If you go out and you do a web search, apparently this is a major problem with all the iPads. That they have these charging issues, and they tell things like, do a hard reset and reload your iPad. I mean, that's just
Good
absurd.
luck.
All right, thank you. We're going to let you go here. Yeah, and it's just absurd. It's a wire. And, Apple is trying to enforce you buying only their product and only their accessories, but they've taken it to a ridiculous extreme, to the point where, in our case, we're using the cable and charger that came with the iPad, and it's still saying, oh, this is not allowed. It really is ridiculous. And it is amazing how many iPhones and iPads Apple is selling. In fact, the iPhone is the only part of Apple's business that is profitable right now. Looking very careful at Apple's earnings, and they did very well, but it's all the iPhone. All their other product lines are in decline. They've become a one-product company, and if that product runs into trouble, so does Apple here. All righty. Now, over in Gaza, there are yet more victims of not only Israel's attacks, but this attempt to starve the people of Gaza into rescinding the charges at the International Criminal Court. Israel has frozen their tax revenues. The U.S. is cutting off financial support. It's just getting worse and worse. And there's this horrible story about this small zoo in Gaza where they are so short of money and food, the animals are starving to death. And it's just another indication of the extreme cruelty that Israel visits on those people. Article out of Blacklisted News. Anti-austerity anger sweeps from Greece to Spain as hundreds of thousands march through Madrid in support of fledgling radical leftist party. And get the spin there, radical leftists. They're radical leftists. You shouldn't pay attention. Of course, that's what they were saying about Syriza. And Syriza's victory in Greece is boosting the respectability and support for anti-austerity parties all across Europe. And apparently, the Podemos party, which stands for We Can, Right now, they're actually leading in current polls. If there was an election coming up, they would win. Because Greece has taught the people of Europe that, yes, if they unite on that one cause, they can vote out the bankers' puppet rulers. And so I'm in agreement with all those articles we're seeing in the financial papers that Syriza's victory in Greece has just thrown terror into the hearts of the European money junkies, and for that matter, the American money junkies, because the people of the world have awakened to the reality of this scam called private central banking and how it is intentionally designed to put the human race into perpetual debt slavery to the bankers, rule by compound interest. And it's no more a legitimate form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And like those past failed systems, it only works as long as you believe this is the way the world is supposed to be. And the human race is waking up and realizing that, no, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And it's time for a change. This rush to create a global government and global financial system has created a planet that could see a global revolution. Everywhere at once. Kick out the bankers, kick out their lackeys in government, go back to honest money systems, a public currency handled as a public utility, which is how the United States started. And the private central bankers hate that. They absolutely hate that. They want the world enslaved to their particular brand of ink and paper, loaned into circulation at interest, a mechanism which by design produces more debt than money with which to pay the debt. You can never get out of their system of slavery. The only way you break free is to stop believing in it and say, this is nonsense. All these trillions you say that we owe you, it never existed. It's a fraud. It's a hoax to steal your wealth and your freedom from you. And it's past its sell-by date. And that's a big part of what's going on in Europe. And I cheer on the people of Greece and the people of Spain and Italy and France and every other European nation that's ready to stand up and say, this has to go. There's the music. I need to get out of here and get some things done this afternoon. Actually, I got to do Jim Goddard's show. And then I'm working on an animation project. And we'll be back tomorrow here on the Genesis Communication Network. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, stay skeptical, stay angry, share what you know with who you know. Please support Genesis Communication and whatreallyhappened.com. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.